June 6, 1944, D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history. 156,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, France, in a desperate gamble to liberate Europe from Nazi tyranny. The world watched as American, British, and Canadian forces fought their way across 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Against overwhelming odds, they succeeded. The Atlantic Wall was breached. Hitler's fortress Europe had been cracked open. But what happened next nearly destroyed everything they had fought for. As Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches, they entered a landscape unlike anything they had trained for. The French countryside of Normandy, a region known as the Bocage, became their worst nightmare. For centuries, Norman farmers had cleared stones from their fields and piled them along property lines, creating massive earthen banks. Over time, these mounds grew thick with vegetation, dense hedges, tangled bushes, and towering trees reaching 15 to 20 feet high. These weren't the neat, trimmed hedges you'd find in an English garden. These were ancient barriers, 4 feet of solid earth and rock, covered with root systems so interlocked they were nearly impossible to excavate, even with machinery. They surrounded small, irregular fields, creating a natural maze that stretched for miles. The Bocage extended across the Cotentin Peninsula and south through Brittany, Maine, and Vendée, in some areas stretching 50 miles inland. Each small field, typically no more than 300 feet across, was completely enclosed by these impenetrable walls. General Walter Bedell Smith, Chief of Staff to Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower, described it perfectly. Every small field was a fortress, every hedgerow a German strongpoint. The Germans recognized the defensive potential immediately. They dug foxholes directly into the hedgerow embankments, positioning machine gunners and riflemen with perfect protection from overhead artillery fire. Snipers hid in the dense foliage above. Anti-tank weapons covered every gap in the hedgerow patchwork. For the American infantry, it became a horrifying battle of attrition. They had to fight from field to field, never knowing where the next ambush would come from. The narrow sunken roads between hedgerows became death traps. Progress was measured not in miles, but in yards, and paid for with blood. But the real problem was the tanks. The Allies had superiority in armor, hundreds of M4 Sherman tanks, M5 Stuart light tanks, and M10 tank destroyers. These should have been the key to rapid advancement. But in the Bocage, they became sitting ducks. When a Sherman tried to push over a hedgerow, the tank would ride up the earthen bank, exposing its belly, the thinnest, most vulnerable part of its armor, to German anti-tank guns hiding just beyond. The tank's own guns couldn't depress enough to fire at the enemy. It was a perfect kill shot, and the Germans took full advantage. Dozer tanks, Shermans equipped with bulldozer blades, could force their way through, but there were only 4 per battalion of 70 tanks. And they were so conspicuous that German gunners made them target number 1. Combat engineers tried using explosives to blow gaps in the hedgerows, but the blasts drew immediate German artillery fire, and there weren't nearly enough explosives for the thousands of hedgerows they would encounter. In just 17 days of fighting through the Bocage, the Americans suffered 40,000 casualties. The breakthrough that was supposed to follow D-Day had ground to a bloody halt. Born February 10, 1915, in Cranford, New Jersey, Curtis Culin came from distinguished American stock. His great-grandfather, Colonel Curtis Grubb, had fought the British during the Revolutionary War. Curtis was a proud member of the Sons of the American Revolution, carrying on a family tradition of service that spanned generations. But by the time Curtis Culin came of age, America was in the grip of the Great Depression. Like millions of his generation, Culin learned to improvise, to make do with what you had, to fix things rather than replace them. These weren't just skills. They were survival instincts. Culin joined the New Jersey National Guard, serving with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, known proudly as the Essex Troop. When America entered World War II, the Essex Troop became part of the 2nd Armored Division, and Culin found himself training as a tanker. By June 1944, Curtis Culin was 29 years old, practically ancient compared to most of the 18- and 19-year-old soldiers around him. His men called him Bud. He was quiet, thoughtful, and utterly unremarkable. Exactly the kind of NCO who keeps an army running, but never makes the history books. Until July 1944, in a hedgerow somewhere in Normandy. Throughout July, soldiers at every level were desperately trying to solve the hedgerow problem. The 79th Infantry Division developed a hedge cutter by July 5th. 19th Corps demonstrated a set of prongs a few days later. V Corps invented brush cutters and green dozers. Innumerable other designs were proposed, tested, and often failed. One day in mid-July, a group of enlisted men in the 2nd Armored Division sat around discussing the bocage problem. Among them was a soldier from Tennessee, a man history would remember only as Roberts. "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" The other soldiers laughed. It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a cartoon. Saw teeth on a tank? But Curtis Culin didn't laugh. While the others joked, he grabbed a pencil and started sketching. Culin recognized something the others had missed. Roberts's idea wasn't ridiculous, it was brilliant. The problem wasn't just getting through the hedgerow, it was doing it without exposing the tank's vulnerable underbelly. What if, instead of riding up and over the hedgerow, the tank could cut through it at ground level? Cullen's mind raced back to the beaches. Just days after D-Day, he'd seen miles of German beach obstacles. Massive steel structures designed to rip apart landing craft. The Germans called them Czech hedgehogs, 6-foot-tall barriers made of angle iron and steel I-beams welded together. Now those hedgehogs were just scrap metal littering the beach. The invasion was over. The obstacles were just sitting there. Culin worked out the details. Take the steel I-beams from the German obstacles, cut them to length, about 3 feet each, angle the ends and sharpen them like tusks, weld them onto reinforced metal plates, bolt the whole assembly to the front of the tank, specifically to the armored transmission housing where the weight could be supported. 4 prongs, like the tusks of a rhinoceros charging through the bush. Culin took his design up the chain of command, captain to major to colonel. Each officer recognized the potential, but it was Major General Leonard G. Hedgerow, commanding the 5th Corps, who decided to give it a real test. July 14, 1944. Near the 2nd Infantry Division headquarters, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the entire 1st U.S. Army, received an urgent call from General Hedgerow. "Can you meet me at the 2nd Division? We've got something you need to see." Omar Bradley was under immense pressure. The bocage was strangling his offensive. Casualties were mounting. The operation that was supposed to break through to open tank country and race across France had stalled. Some critics were already whispering that the Normandy invasion might fail after all. Bradley needed a miracle. When Bradley arrived, he found Hedgerow and several staff officers clustered around a light tank. Welded to its front was a crude-looking contraption, a crossbar with 4 tusk-like prongs jutting forward. Standing nearby was a sergeant, 29 years old, nervous, probably wondering what a 3-star general was doing, looking at his welding job. The tank's engine roared to life. It backed away from a nearby hedgerow, one of those ancient earthen walls that had stopped the American advance cold. Then it charged forward at 10 miles per hour. The tusks hit the hedgerow and bit deep into the earthen bank. Instead of riding up and exposing its belly, the tank stayed level. The prongs pinned the tank down, keeping it horizontal. The engine screamed. Earth exploded in all directions, and the tank burst through. Bradley stood in stunned silence. Then they rolled up a Sherman tank, equipped with the same device, bigger, heavier. The Sherman charged the hedgerow, same result. The wall exploded. The Sherman crashed through under a shower of dirt and vegetation, emerging on the other side intact, level, ready to fight. Years later, in his memoir, A Soldier's Story, Bradley described that moment. So absurdly simple that it had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks, the tusk-like device had been fashioned by Curtis G. Culin, a 29-year-old sergeant. Bradley didn't hesitate. He ordered every ordnance unit in the 1st Army into round-the-clock production. As many Sherman tanks as possible were to be fitted with the device immediately. The raw material was everywhere. Thousands of German beach obstacles were collected from the Normandy beaches. What had been Hitler's Atlantic Wall was now being repurposed to smash through his hedgerow defenses. The irony was not lost on anyone. Ordnance units worked around the clock. Welders, cutters, mechanics. The modifications were crude but effective. Each Culin Rhino device, as it quickly became known, took several hours to fabricate and install. Around 500 devices were manufactured in Normandy alone. 3 out of every 5 American tanks in the First Army were turned into Rhino tanks. The 2nd Armored Division equipped nearly 3/4 of their Shermans, Stuarts, and M10 tank destroyers. The British Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, REME, saw the American design and immediately put it into production. They called them Prongs rather than Rhinos, but the concept was identical. 600 Mark I Prongs were delivered by August, with another 1,000 Mark II Prongs for Shermans and M10s, and 500 Mark III Prongs designed for Cromwell tanks. But here's the brilliant part. Bradley ordered absolute secrecy. No Rhino tanks were to be used in combat until a major offensive was launched. He wanted the element of surprise. The Germans knew the Allies were stuck in the bocage. They were confident their defensive positions were unbreakable. Bradley wanted to shock them with a sudden, overwhelming breakthrough. July 18th, July 20th, July 24th, Bradley was planning something big, something that would change the entire war, an operation with a name that struck fear, Operation Cobra, July 25th, 1944. After being delayed by terrible weather, Operation Cobra was ready to launch. The plan was audacious. A massive carpet bombing campaign would pulverize a rectangular area 3.5 miles wide and 1.5 miles deep along the Saint-Lô-Perrier road. Then, before the Germans could recover, American ground forces would punch through with concentrated infantry and armor attacks. At 9:38 a.m., the sky filled with aircraft, fighter bombers, medium bombers, heavy bombers. More than 2,000 Allied aircraft dropping thousands of tons of high explosives and fragmentation bombs on German positions. The earth itself seemed to convulse. German defensive positions simply ceased to exist. But war is chaos. Some bombs fell short, killing 25 American soldiers and wounding 131 others. Among the casualties was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. Friendly fire, a tragic reminder that even the best plans go wrong in combat. But there was no time to mourn. At 11 a.m., American infantry moved forward through the devastated landscape. Behind them, hundreds of tanks assembled, including the Rhino tanks, about to be used in combat for the first time. When the Rhino tanks hit the bocage, everything changed. No more slow, dangerous climbs over earthen walls. No more exposed undersides for German anti-tank gunners to target. The Rhinos simply smashed straight through at speed, emerging on the other side with guns blazing. Narrator: the Germans were stunned. Their carefully prepared defensive positions, those hedgerow fortresses that had held up the American advance for weeks, were suddenly worthless. Tanks were appearing where tanks weren't supposed to be able to go. Narrator: the 2nd Armored Division's 82nd Reconnaissance Battalion led the charge. For 5 weeks they'd been held in reserve because the bocage was infantry fighting. Now, finally, they could do what they'd been trained for: fast, aggressive armored reconnaissance. July 27th. The Germans' lines began to crack. July 28th. The breakthrough was achieved. July 31st. American forces emerged from the bocage and captured Avranches, the gateway to Brittany and southern Normandy. They were through. After 2 months of fighting through the nightmare of the Norman hedgerows, the Americans had finally reached open tank country. And they weren't stopping. Operation Cobra transformed the entire nature of the Normandy campaign. What had been a slow, grinding battle of attrition became rapid maneuver warfare. The American Third Army, activated on August 1st under General George Patton, raced east toward Paris and south toward the Loire Valley. The 82nd Reconnaissance Battalion crossed into Belgium on September 2nd, 1944, the first U.S. Army unit to do so. August 25th, 1944. Paris was liberated. The symbolic heart of France was free again. The German 7th Army, caught in what became known as the Falaise Pocket, was virtually destroyed. 50,000 Germans were captured. 10,000 were killed. the German strategic position in northwestern France collapsed completely. Military historian Max Hastings would later write that the Culin Hedgerow Cutter had restored battlefield mobility to the Allied forces. Chester Wilmot, the famous war correspondent, credited the Rhino tanks with enabling the American breakout. Not everyone agreed. Some historians argue the devices were less effective than the legend suggests. But there's no question about what the soldiers themselves believed. They saw those Rhino tanks smash through hedgerows that had stopped them cold for weeks. President Dwight Eisenhower, in a 1961 address to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, recalled the moment. The biggest and happiest group, I suppose, in all the Allied armies that night were those that knew that this thing worked. Curtis Culin became an overnight celebrity, the kind of American hero that the war effort desperately needed. The humble sergeant who saved the invasion with scrap metal and common sense. The Cranford Citizen and Chronicle reported on September 7, 1944, that Sergeant Bud Culin's invention would probably revolutionize warfare in the Normandy section of France. General Bradley said as much directly. Narrator, Culin was awarded the Legion of Merit, one of the highest decorations for exceptional service. But according to historian Max Hastings, Culin was an honest man who repeatedly tried to give credit where it was due. He insisted that the original idea came from Roberts, that Tennessee soldier whose offhand comment about saw teeth had sparked the whole thing. But in the publicity surrounding the invention, Roberts' contribution was forgotten. Curtis Culin had become a very American kind of national hero, as Hastings put it. But war is indiscriminate in its cruelty. Later that year, in the brutal Hurtgen Forest, one of the bloodiest battles the Americans would fight, Culin stepped on a landmine. He lost a leg and was medically evacuated. The man who had saved countless lives with his ingenuity became another casualty of war. After recovering in military hospitals, Curtis Culin returned home to New York City. In 1945, he married Bernice Enright. They settled in Greenwich Village, trying to build a normal life after the extraordinary events of the war. Culin took a job as a liquor salesman for Schenley Industries. It was about as far from battlefield heroics as you could get. But maybe that's what he wanted. Normalcy, quiet, a chance to forget. For almost 2 decades, Curtis Culin lived the ordinary life of an ordinary American. He wasn't someone who sought attention or traded on his wartime fame. He was just Bud Culin, salesman, husband, veteran, one of millions of men who'd served, done their part, and come home. November 20th, 1963, Curtis Grubb Culin III died in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. He was just 48 years old. Narrator, today a plaque dedicated to Curtis Culin is affixed to a boulder on North Union Avenue in Cranford, New Jersey. It's a small memorial to a man who changed history with 4 pieces of scrap metal and a simple idea. Operation Overlord, D-Day, is remembered as one of the greatest military operations in history. We remember the beach landings, the paratroopers, the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, the sacrifice at Omaha Beach. But the story doesn't end on June 6, 1944. The real battle for Normandy took place in those hedgerows. In the bocage that nearly broke the Allied advance, the Culin Hedgerow Cutter, those crude tusks welded from German beach obstacles, represent something profound about American ingenuity and the democratic nature of warfare. The solution didn't come from generals or engineers or weapons designers. It came from enlisted men, a Tennessee soldier who made a joke, and a New Jersey sergeant who took it seriously. War is often decided by the small things, the overlooked details. The moment someone says, "What if?" and someone else says, "Let's try it." Curtis Culin's invention didn't win the war, but it helped break open the door that led to victory. From scrap metal and desperation, Curtis Culin built a tool that changed history. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest innovations come not from laboratories or headquarters, but from ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. People willing to think differently, to improvise, to turn obstacles into opportunities. In memory of Sergeant Curtis Grubb, Culin III, 1915 to 1963, and all those who fought in the hedgerows of Normandy,